Hi, beautiful community long form question and answer session. Each question is from an individual person, so I'm going to answer it briefly but with a bit more intentionality than the collated questions. And sometimes I'll read the question, sometimes I'll just read a summary of it. Matthew M. asks, do you think the recent Ukraine strike that caused mass casualties among apparently mobilized Russian soldiers will move public opinion, the needle of public opinion among disinterested Russians? You've discussed before that any changes among the disaffected majority will be gradual, and I'm curious to hear your take on whether high-profile events have bearing on this movement. Few things are worth mentioning. First, no event on Ukrainian territory, that's a mass casualty event, is likely to have a vast impact on Russian public opinion. I would guess, this is sort of facetious, that Putin hasn't even reached 1/4 of his quote-unquote permitted limit for incurring casualties. So whatever the number is now, he can quadruple it and still be relatively okay, in my view, with the Russian population. One of the trends that I believe we're going to be seeing more and more in 2023, now, this year, is the war going onto Russian territory. And not in the metaphorical sense, but literally. That can have more of an effect. But overall, the level of depoliticization of the Russian population can't be underestimated. And I feel that I've conveyed just, I would say, 50% of that story about how that depoliticization comes about. I think there's a deeper story to tell that I haven't told yet about how there's a certain sense that the Russian regime is itself a kind of alien external force as far as the Russian population see it and relate to it. That's worth talking about more. So I'm very skeptical about the needle being moved. The key move that I think that is likely to arise beyond any other move in 2023 in terms of the demographic shifts in public mood and public sensibility in Russia is that I think there's going to be a consolidation this year of the non-pro-Putin, pro-war party. And Putin is going to have to make some moves to obstruct that. Because if there is going to be, you see, you're asking me about a shift, but if there is going to be a shift about things going badly in the war, the shift is going to be, Mr. Putin, where's your victory? Mr. Putin, no victory? Oh, no victory? That's going to be still perhaps a minority of the population with certain kinds of echoes, rippling through that passive blob in the middle. But basically, that's not going to do much. And if we're going to see one kind of movement, it's not going to be an anti-war movement. It's going to be a Mr. Putin, where's your victory movement, led by a few groupings, a few individuals that have an impact on 10-15% of the population, with that rippling through a little bit into that passive blob. Pessimistic, but realistic. Alice asks, will Putin close the border in 2023? So I had two senses about this, that they're going to do everything they can to not do that, and that they are little by little drifting toward a situation where doing that becomes more likely. So just visualize a wave of mobilization much more significant than anything we've seen so far. I mean, military mobilization. Would that not be accompanied by a trickiness at the border that goes far beyond anything we've seen so far? I mean, that just makes a lot of sense. So I have no idea if they will, and I think they clearly don't want to, but I think that as each month goes by, it perhaps becomes more plausible that that might happen. Benjamin asks, will the war end in 2023? We've got to talk about this in a lot more detail, so I'll just be sort of farcically brief. It could, easily, but there is no indication of this. So I'm not comfortable to say that the war is likely to end in 2023. There is no evidence of that makes political sense to me. There is no evidence of that I can derive from military analysis, on which I can't really comment. So I would love it to end in 2023. I think it could easily end in 2023, but at the moment, that's not how it's looking. But as I said, this is a very uncertain situation. Things can change. So if you think that's a pessimistic answer, then yeah, it's a pessimistic answer. Graeters asks, should we look to Western democracy questions? So we'll be brief today. Should we look at FDR as an example of how to fix democracies with a New Deal so that they become immune to tyrannical temptations and brutality brought about by unsolved long-term corruption? No. As my colleague Mark Liller might say about a suggestion like that, it's a bit like trying to get a generation of bees that do not live in a hive to get back and live in a hive. They're just not going to do that. So there are many kinds of forces, and Ukraine is going to have to reckon with this too after the war. Global forces that make for fluidity in our societies. That means we have to have different solutions. We are not going to be able to rely on ways of generating citizen trust and a sense of civic belonging that worked back then and made various kinds of different models of the welfare state possible. So the problem we've got now is that there is no model of any kind, left or right, from the 20th century that we can return that will work. But that's a conversation we're going to need to continue. Elisabeth asks, are the sanctions working? Yes, they are working. Sanctions against Russia. But you see, they're working as long as you understand that there are two modes to them. The first mode to the sanctions is a reactive sort of mode. We've got to do something. What can we do? We can do this. Let's do it. So we've done it. And we can debate about efficacy, what could have been done differently, what more should be done. And that's actually, there are some open spaces still to explore. But that's something that's inevitable. It's the central logic of the sanctions. And you've got to think of it in terms of, well, what would happen if we didn't, right? Was there an option not to? And that's that first pillar of the sanctions. The second pillar of the sanctions is to incrementally slow the Putin regime's capacity to engage in wars of this kind. And it seems to me that is happening. So, are the sanctions bringing about the demise of the Putin regime little by little? No, they're not. If you backed me up against the wall and asked me to get on one side of the other or the other of this judgment of whether sanctions will help Putin consolidate power, whether they will weaken him, I would argue it's more likely they will consolidate his position. But that just means sanctions are not working if they're there to overthrow Putin in your mind. And that's, of course, a very unfortunate way to think about them, because they will just look farcically ineffective. But that's not what they're for. Sanctions are us doing something when we needed to do what we could do, and they're about sort of bleeding out Putin's capacity to engage over the medium to long term in the sort of thing he is engaging now. And from that point of view, I think they're working. Joseph asks, how do you define an imperial mentality? I must say, I get that question probably 70 times a week in different versions. And that makes me think that, I don't know what you think about it, all of you, whether it would justify a video on the main channel. Because a lot of folks in Ukraine, a lot of folks in the Baltics are saying, well, hang on, some of these oppositional Russians still have an imperial mindset. What's it mean to say that? What coherent claims of that kind are available? What kind of a conversation is this? How do we think about this? So I think that's a possibility. I think that's a possibility for a video of this level of enthusiasm about this question continues. Partly because I'm hearing a lot of obstruction of thought with this term, imperial mentality. In other words, somebody mentions it, and that's a typical indication they've stopped thinking. And that's bad, partly because this is actually a legitimate and important question. How do you let go certain kinds of imperialistic prejudices and dispositions if you're Russian? But you got to think about that question and not use these terms as a way of just throwing something over a fence that in fact terminates thought inside us. And that there are real dangers there in Ukraine too, because so much Ukrainian discourse fetishizes anti-colonialism rather than engaging in real anti-colonialism. And that discourse going into a more deeper and more superficial direction, that's a very important crossroads for the post-war Ukrainian project. So let me just say one thing, because this is going to be an endless conversation. You've got to distinguish between something that you would call an imperial mentality in a private conversation and something that you would call an imperial mentality for the purpose of politics. I mean, in other words, let's change topic. Racism. Who's racist, right? Well, in some dimensions towards some groups, most people are racist, a little bit. But that's not what matters. What matters is racism that has a political significance. You know, it's a very significant thing to say in political terms that a certain policy, a certain institutional arrangement, a certain practice, and so on is racist. That's very different to saying that in private. The way we understand what qualifies that has got to be very different, because in the political category, what we call racism has to serve political purposes. If your definition of racism ends up being politically counterproductive vis-a-vis the group you're trying to elevate, or the group you're trying to protect from deprioritization, let's say, well, that's a disaster, and you can't do that. And you're free from all of that if you're just having a kind of a private conversation. So as a political project, the idea of getting Russians purified from imperialistic imagery is obviously farcical. That's not what one's after. One's after the elimination of expressions of imperial disposition insofar as they impact political reality, right? So that's an important distinction I would make. You've got to have a political definition of imperialism, and then you've got to have something looser that you can discuss away from the table of politics and at the dinner table. More later. Aurashi asks, I'm so sorry I'm mispronouncing your name, Vlad, how do you view communism as an ideology, and to what extent do you think it has played a part in Russia's current situation? That is huge, and I can't answer it. So let me say a tiny couple of things around the edges. Throughout the history of the West, there's been a tendency to say, in the way we think about society, that we can overcome conflict between human beings, and we can overcome conflict of values, such that justice and freedom, solidarity and security, peace and dignity, whatever, become harmonious. And there have been essentially two lanes, one very big one and one very small one, about how one goes about that. The very big lane involves all kinds of projects which say that if only we think about these values properly, we're going to realize that they don't really have to be in conflict. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau says that in one form, in a totally different form. Immanuel Kant says that we can prescribe and ascertain principles of right and justice that will sit above all of these conflicts of value and allow us to arbitrate them. One lane. If you think about these values properly, we'll see they're not in conflict. But the other lane is there's going to be some kind of an historical transformation that gets us to a place where these values are no longer in conflict. And Marxism is one very fundamental, very important example of that kind of enterprise, which says, no, you can't do it the way Jean-Jacques or Emmanuel want to do it, but you can do it by understanding that history actually goes through a certain series of stages, and there will be a stage in some other world where things are possible that aren't possible in this one. I actually think both of these enterprises are delusory. So that's one thought on the big intellectual picture there. In the more historical sense, I suppose you could say, look, Marxism has everything to do with what happened in the Soviet Union. Marxism has nothing to do, number two, with what happened in the Soviet Union, or somewhere in the middle. And I think that obviously it would be silly to think that Marxism has everything to do with what happened in the Soviet Union, and the terminus of that is to hold Marx accountable for these events. But the view that there aren't very significant continuities between Marx's ideas, between Lenin's ideas, and what Lenin's manipulation of Marx's ideas, and then what happens in practice in that stretch of history, that extraordinary experiment in Western utopia on Russian soil. I am somebody who would argue that there are continuities. That's how I think about that. And then you're asking, it's played a part in Russia's current situation. Well, if we're talking about whether the Soviet legacy has played a part in Russia's current situation, then yes, enormously so. And here there are just too many things to say. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that. MusikCasette asks, when Russia fully withdraws from the Ukraine, Ukraine will need economic help, but Russia too. My opinion is that Western powers should extend that help to Russia, but with conditions attached. Do you agree, and what conditions would those be attached to such a program? I see a removal of the sanctions, basically. That's all I see. And that can happen insofar as certain steps are taken. And that might involve the withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. It might involve the freeing of political prisoners in Russia. It might involve the payment of reparations to Ukraine. And it might involve certain minimal steps of democratic consolidation in Russia, which sounds hugely optimistic, I must say. But if Russia has withdrawn from Ukraine, if Russia is not threatening its neighbors, if Russia is perhaps paying reparations, if Russia is releasing its political prisoners, if Russia is running through a series of moderately free elections, at that point, little by little, the sanctions can be lifted, and if there is going to be more, that is simply going to depend on how far Russia evolves from being an authoritarian tyranny. So that's how I see that picture optimistically. If the West is still in place, and a decade or two from now, with enough clarity of vision to execute on this. Mark asks, why didn't they shut YouTube? I think that there is so much non-political activity that Russians do on YouTube that it's overwhelmingly the hardest platform to shut, and is overwhelmingly the platform that maybe more than all the others put together is going to jar the depoliticized blob in the middle. So they might well do it, and the trend is again possibly in that direction, but it's the hardest platform for them to shut, because YouTube is very good at keeping depoliticized Russians on the couch. There's so much stats to back that up, which I don't remember off the top of my head. But even instinctively, I just feel how enormously powerful YouTube is in Russia, compared with pretty much any other platform. Gustavo asks, how do Russians who are depoliticized or pro-Putin see Zelensky? They think that he was a clown before politics, and now he is a clown and a puppet, an American puppet. I think that captures it. What should, that's Clara, what should Western leaders do to control nuclear risk? I think the single most important thing is that in Washington and a couple of major European capitals, there is enough of a sense of alarm bells ringing. And I think this is a matter of political intuition, and we're going to talk about political intuition, but that's what really matters. I don't believe that we're in a situation where nuclear risk can be taken off the table, but there isn't anything that a think tank can come up with here. Nor do I think there is anything that a nuclear weapons expert can come up with here. I think that we're talking about making sure that if a time comes when alarm bells should be ringing, that they do indeed ring. Ole asks, what is Russia going to do with Ukraine in the hypothetical scenario, which presumably you don't believe, that Russia does take over all of Ukraine? And are they going to reconstruct that territory without Ukrainians and move Russian people over there? I don't see how, in a different scenario in which the West doesn't help Ukraine, that Ukraine fails to fight back. I don't see anything that Russia could do, even if it had military control over the country, that would allow it to have ideological control over the country. That just wouldn't happen. And no, I don't think Ukrainians would all just leave. I don't think that power, militarily speaking, solves your problem when you're walking into what is basically a wave, a brick wall of an anti-colonial movement. You're screwed with that. You cannot do anything about it. Marcin asks, where do you think we stand with no longer considering Russia as a superpower? This mental model is what underpins both the Russian imperialism inside Russia and the "oh my God, don't anger Mr. Putin" attitude of so many people in Europe and the United States. This is why possibly Mearsheimer has so much support. But the truth is Russia is not the Soviet Union, except for the case of nukes. But here, realistically, I doubt that anyone would be okay with Russia using them to gain advantage on the battlefield. Let me take just a part of that, and I think speak to something that's a psychological thing. I do think that there is indeed a kind of prejudice that is an echo from the Cold War about Russia's undefeatability that has a hold over quite a few people in the West. I recognize that as a thing, yeah. And I say that as somebody who absolutely doesn't take nuclear risk off the table. And I think that a lot of these people are beginning to change their perspective, because events are increasingly suggesting that it's worth reevaluating this sort of relic of the Cold War subconscious image of Russian might. John asks, it would be an interesting thought experiment as to how NATO and the US would react to China invading outer Manchuria to protect the ethnic Chinese-speaking inhabitants. Of course, I understand this is a stretch and a thought experiment. I mean, that's a spectacularly low probability scenario. And presumably would be a scenario that happens when if Russia begins to fall apart, something I'm skeptical about, but open to. So until Russia falls apart, how does China take Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, which are in that region, without ending up with a nuclear war with Russia? I mean, you can push Russia out if it's invaded you. You can bomb Russian territory without Russia using nuclear weapons, but you can't really invade Russia without Russia using nuclear weapons unless Russia is in some kind of a pattern of disintegration. I have not heard anything remotely compelling from Chinese watchers that makes this suggestion remotely plausible. Questions today of dynamics in the Chinese regime are very, very interesting, and you can see commentators evaluating the possibility of some kind of a subtle, if not a coup, a subtle realignment of the balance of power at the top of that regime, particularly with this extravagantly unprepared radical pivot away from zero COVID, which is going to be catastrophic for the country done the way it's being done. But if we begin to bring ourselves back to planet Earth, really, what I see is China over time gaining more and more leverage and more influence over Russia, in parts of Russia, without needing to invade, because Russia is going to be in a progressively vulnerable position in its relationship, progressively dependent position in its relationship with China. I've copped out, but I think you also asked me to sort of travel to the moon with this. JanesBrain, Jane, asks, I just heard a Russian general make an argument for tactical nukes. The West is self-evidently supplying arms to Ukraine, one, to help them, but two, to test Western equipment against Russian equipment. I don't personally agree with this particular Russian general. Tactical nukes should be put on the table, but his argument as someone clearly on the losing side seems reasonable, presumably reasonable in some kind of rational choice way. The West is most definitely doing live-fire testing of weapon systems in Ukraine. How do you feel this plays into the nuclear calculus of Putin's inner circle? If I'm understanding you, you're saying that it's not our support of Ukraine, but the fact that we are taking for a test drive some surveillance systems, some electronic systems, some weapon systems in Ukraine, and that could somehow increase the chances or the logic of Russians using nuclear weapons. Well, that premise is correct, but I think the conclusion I don't share. So, sure, plenty of things are being taken for a test drive in Ukraine, and sure, plenty of countries are very keen to see what that looks like in practice, and also to use this as an opportunity to send signals to foes, including China. But what that does for non-strategic nuclear risk, I don't know, to be honest. If I'm understanding your question rightly, then my answer is no, that doesn't worry me much. I am, of course, worried about nuclear risk, and I'm particularly worried about this element that's being missed by most commentators, which is what I call Putin's less total aversion to a strategic nuclear exchange, that Putin really wants to avoid a strategic nuclear exchange, and we really want to avoid it. And I made an argument about how this is important to understand, and how applying certain narrow models of rationality to Putin makes us miss this. But that doesn't really imply anything about tactical nuclear weapons. And in terms of your question, I'm not worried, but you've got a second bit of the question. I'm interested if you've heard Zizek's thought on the current conflict and what your thoughts on his thoughts are. I actually haven't listened to Zizek much. So what I've done, if that will please you, is just picked a fairly random quote from a recent interview, which I'm going to read now and see if we agree with it. Zizek says, here's my pessimistic assessment. Do you remember the beginning of the war? Although we nominally supported Ukraine, secretly so many people from the left and the right admitted to me that the bad surprise was that Ukraine defended itself. They wanted the war to be over quickly, because then, yeah, we will condemn Russia. But after a couple of years of playing this boycott game, we'll accept a new reality, and so on and so on. I think there's a lot in that, and I think that there's been a remarkable failure on the anti-imperialistic Western left to recognize how their view of the world fits with this war. And in that sense, they have been victimized by their own anti-imperialist sentiments, grabbing hold of the anti-imperialist stick with such intensity that they haven't realized that they're holding something else instead. Zizek is generally a wonderful intellectual entertainer of the highest level. And he is somebody who is a kind of, and he will take that as much less of an insult than most people would, a kind of defecator, that he comes and reveals that certain things that we believe are higher things, in fact, aren't, but stem from lower things, and this needs to be unmasked. And sometimes he literally feels that there is benefit in coming and making a mess. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. But I would classify Zizek as a wonderful intellectual entertainer with the greatest capacity for constructive aphoristic observations, but it's largely the entertainment game. Nick asks, I first came to know you through the channel of Arthur Ray, and Arthur has an opinion that slightly shocks me, and it's that America as a nation likes the war in Ukraine because that's America's enemy being mauled by a third party in a geopolitically advantageous way. I'm American myself, I'm not naive about my country or my country's history, but I find this opinion slightly ignorant and hurtful. Americans are sympathetic with Ukraine, and the American government, the American military, has certainly a cold-hearted eagerness to help the Ukrainian military. However, this is primarily driven by the fear that Russia might go beyond Ukraine, which would inevitably lead to worse things to come that we want to avoid. Well, Nick, I don't know where your disagreement with Arthur lies, or what Arthur actually thinks about this. So I can't comment on that specifically, but let me make a proposal to you maybe, and a just a basic sketchy suggestion. The sketchy suggestion is that for me deduction isn't good enough. I want psychological reality when we're talking about ascribing intent. Even when we are trying to figure out the action, the intent, right? To ascribe intent to a series of complexly acting individuals and institutions in complex relations with one another. So foreign policy is set. To ascribe intent there, I still want psychological reality. I want to say, well, who are the 2 or the 7 individuals involved in this process who have a certain thing in their heads? I don't like jumping from X overwhelmingly seems to be in the US national interest to just concluding that Joe Biden must feel and think that. Right? So that's one observation. I do want psychological reality if we ascribe intent. But the second question is, why are you scandalized here, as opposed to just in disagreement about wherever you think your disagreement lies there? What's scandalous here? Now, cartoonishly, putting psychological reality aside, sure, the United States doesn't want Ukraine as Russia as a thing getting, in its way, tripping over it as it tries to, in the medium term, focus on China. We want to get the Russian problem out of the way. The more we can incapacitate Russia, the better. Now, What's important isn't what answers you give to these questions, but this business of why you feel scandalized by this. I mean, I don't care what answers you give to the following questions, they're completely reasonable. Why is the United States not setting up Ukraine to win? Could this be partly because they want Russia to be more bogged down for longer in Ukraine? No, not remotely suggesting what the answer is to that. So I'm not doing innuendo like some YouTubers do, but I'm saying just take a view on that, but where's the scandal? Let me take an extreme example. Imagine that somebody came to me and said, Vlad, I think that there are some people in power in the United States who would like Russia to do a non-strategic nuclear strike on Ukraine because that would give the United States the possibility to find itself in the world where Russia is far more isolated and shut away than it can be at the moment. I would say, let's talk about it. Some people feel this. Who feels it? What about the extraordinary danger of seeing tactical nuclear weapons used and so on? So why are you thinking this? Who are you talking about? Why not? But these are all entirely askable questions without scandal. So my question is, unless I'm misunderstanding what Artur has said, and I can't imagine Artur saying something racist about Americans, that they love watching Ukrainians being terrorized. But my basic question to you is, have the view you want to have here, but be suspicious about your own sense of scandalization here. So that's a couple of cents in case it helps. Our last question is from Clara. I wanted to ask, given the scorched earth tactics in Grozny and Aleppo, do you think Russia is traumatized, desensitized, and immune to atrocities its government is unleashing upon Ukraine? I don't think that's how it works. In other words, with Syria, and the destruction of Aleppo is as bad as the destruction of Paris or Rome. You've got to be aware of that. We just don't react to it like that because it's not in Europe. But with Syria, Russians just, except a small minority, don't care. And there's always a small, dedicated anti-war minority group in Russia. But broadly speaking, most people just don't care. In Ukraine, it's different. I think there is actually an aspect with Ukraine where they care to such a degree that they can't bear to admit that what's happening is real. So that's different. Democratic countries, you say, are capable of inflicting dire harm on other nations, but at some point the leader is held accountable, even if it's just as a short legacy. Putin has raged for decades, totally unaccountable. So do you think it's fair to say inflicting harm on its neighbors, or the concept of inflicting harm being the natural order of things, seems to have become part of the default setting of the Russian psyche? Now, I don't think you do have an answer, Claire, if I ask you what the Russian psyche is. And that's why I think this is a great question, but it's only a great question if we're slow with it, and it's a less great question if we're fast with it. Because fast means that we go back to what we mentioned earlier in this conversation about just using words that help us to stop thinking. And the Russian psyche is typically a term that stops people thinking. Now, the sort of frame I would use here is this. It's very important that when human beings behave badly, they're not failing to be good. They're actually positively behaving destructively. So human beings have not just positive values, positive dispositions that misfire. They also have, if you like, negative values, negative dispositions. And it's very important that we don't end up interpreting, bad things done by people as these people trying to do good things but doing them really, really badly. There's a very, very beautiful young man on the internet, is very well known, called Lex Friedman. And if you listen to Lex, Lex gives the impression that he thinks that Putin is just very bad at loving his country deeply. And that is, of course, stunningly politically naive. So there are these destructive dispositions, and under certain cultural circumstances, some cultures will express them more. And if your culture is more sick, it'll just express them more. And some cultures are more sick than others. Every culture is slightly less or slightly more sick than every other culture. And that's a fascinating conversation too we'll have. Who's healthier, France or Germany? That's a real question. There are real answers to it. It's worth talking about. And Russia is not doing well at the moment with this, expression of destructive energies. And one of the discussions I've had about this has been about that Z symbol, which I do think has been for some people a kind of liberatory matter, being liberated into celebrating evil. There's been a bit of that with that symbol. So this stuff comes in degrees, and some cultures are just in a much worse place with it at certain points. And Russia is today. It might not be in 150 years. Some other culture could be that we now think of as doing relatively well. So that's the sort of tiny beginning of a slow conversation about it that makes your question great. But it's important that slowness is there, because as soon as we take it away, and we go Russian psyche this, Canadian psyche that, Chinese psyche this, we risk the termination rather than the opening up of thoughts and minds. Lots of love to all of you. Talk very soon.